Butler, this is Frostfire. So, and I know this is something that's going to turn some players off, but I don't think it should. Even if it's Fantasy Strike, but like an anime fighter. And even if you don't like Fantasy Strike, I'm saying it's like an approachable game that decides to layer in certain levels of complexity, and it like leans into some of the anime tropes, which is actually really cool. Yeah, it's funny. You're right. You see so many games fall like into the graveyard that it's always great to see one move forward. And yeah, Frostfire has been getting worked on. I'm glad to finally get my hands on it. This is super interesting for me as a longtime Fantasy Strike player. Like, I have been playing Fantasy Strike. I mean, since it was in early pre-alpha, I got my hands on it, and I was always a fan of looking at games in different ways and looking at different types of games and seeing what makes them valuable. Being a player who like started with Street Fighter 2 and then went into like the Marvel Versus series, and then ultimately became a relatively competitive Marvel 3 player, to then say, I want to pick up a game that strips away so much of the like inherent complexity of a lot of the games that I played, and goes down to like, what if a simplified fighter, right? And like Fantasy Strike came out in the era of, like in the wake, I guess, of Dive Kick, which was the almost absurdist look at how simplified can you make a fighting game and still have it be a fighting game, right? I love me some Dive Kick. And I definitely love me some Fantasy Strike, and they're two different approaches to approachable fighting games. And the instant I picked up Frostfire game, I said to myself, wow, this is the natural progression in complexity for the type of game that Fantasy Strike is. I don't know if y'all had ever seen, when Fantasy Strike first came out, Serling Games put out this like scatter chart of complexity in fighting games, and it's like most fighting games are grouped over here on the complex side, and then you have Dive Kick at the opposite end, and Fantasy Strike was trying to position themselves somewhere in like the middle, closer to the middle, right? But on the more approachable side, closer to Dive Kick. So this would be basically on the other side of the like even of the middle of the spectrum. There's a lot of similarities here between Frostfire and Fantasy Strike. Some of them are simply superficial. Like, there's the obvious stuff. We have ourselves a 2D fighter. Frostfire, much like Fantasy Strike, has a single normal attack button with directional normals that do various things, right? And then they have two special buttons. So she has this electric dash, which can go into a number of other things, and then she has this fireball kick. One normal button, two special buttons. We also have a dedicated throw button. There is no crouching. If I hit down, there is no crouching in Frostfire. Another thing that it shares with Fantasy Strike, they used the removal of crouching to remove one of the layers of, like, I don't even want to just say one of the layers of complexity, but it's like, look, fighting games are complicated at their core, and every element of them is going to add an extra layer to your mental stack, for lack of a better term, right? The mental stack, the idea that there is, what are the number of things that your brain can process at the same time and still make an informed decision about it, right? At what point does it become information overload? And people with stronger mental stacks or larger mental stacks will be able to handle more things. But so if you want to aim for a game that is less complex or more approachable, one of the ways to do it is to strip away things that are going to layer into that mental stack calculation. And so removing crouching normals is one way to do it. You've seen a few games do this. Tough Love Arena also does this. You have these dedicated buttons. So one normal, two specials, a throw button. There's a dedicated super button. Once again, I say this is the natural extension, where if you wanted to add a few more layers of complexity to the kind of archetype of the approachable game that Fantasy Strike kind of like embodies, then these are the kind of things you would add. It's like my immediate reaction was, oh, Fantasy Strike, but an anime fighter. So you have a burst, which brings you into a limit mode, which will power up your tools in various ways depending on your character. Much like Fantasy Strike, Frostfire has decided to lean into some of the individual character mechanics, right? Where there's this souls meter for our friend Emily. For this case, Sarah has these electric moves, right? And you can see there's this little electric field around her. If I hit them with two, they go into this stun state, right? So I have a variety of special moves which are electric and can add the state or activate it. Unlike Fantasy Strike, which is very there's basically one character in Fantasy Strike that allows you to do like chain combos and is very combo centric. That's Satsuki, for those who are curious. Everyone kind of has that ability, right? It's a build out of that level of complexity. So if Fantasy Strike was over here on the spectrum, we got Frostfire over here. So everyone has this chain combo system where you can do normal, normal, and then into your directional normal. And then that's cancelable into your specials. Layer in that game plan. What does Sarah want to do? Button, 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 ground, and then hit them with the fireball to activate. So now, I activate that, and I can get a little combo extension. Fantasy Strike lack dashes. We have dashes here. So I really appreciate that, where this is, and there's a lot of meter management in this game, which I really appreciate. I think as a player who came from the Marvel vs. Capcom and the Versus series background, and then who went into playing Fantasy Strike very competitively, it was something that I always felt was missing, where Fantasy Strike does a really good job of having intentional uses for all of your moves and all of the systems, and then interesting lateral uses. But meter management in Fantasy Strike was never really explored in any lateral use. There's one way that meter works, and you only use it for supers. There's very few ways to interact with it. The few ways there are interesting, in my opinion, but it always felt to me that, like, especially once you've played the game for an extended period of time, that would be a layer. What if you could use half of a bar to push block and change positioning? What if you had a meter that allowed you to do EX moves so that there were more ground bounces and wall bounces and things to extend the complexity and reward the technical proficiency of players who want to get to that point? Maybe that clashes with some of the ethos of the game. I don't know. But looking at Frostfire, it's super interesting. I like that I have a smaller button real estate that I'm working from, and I'm using those few tools in more ways. And that's a cool thing. Absolutely, Ducky. I like that we're starting to get the full spectrum of more simplified, streamlined, approachable fighting games. There are multiple ways to do these things. Power Rangers Battle for the Grid is one way to strip that stuff away. Smash Brothers is one way to strip that stuff away. There are a bunch of different ways that you can do that, and I appreciate Fantasy Strike for what it does, but it doesn't serve the needs of all the players or certain types of players. And if you crave something a little bit more complex, then you can get a little bit further than that with something like Frostfire, without being like I'm playing Fate Unlimited codes where I have to TK special cancel everything under the sun, right? Like I said, I think there's some interesting comparisons, as this is a natural progression to some of the more simplified fighting games. When the trend towards super simplified fighting games first started, we went like super hard in the like, let's strip everything away, right? And it's been layering in more stuff, and it's been really interesting because I like being part of the Fantasy Strike community and seeing that style of game bring in players who were afraid to play fighting games. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but a not insignificant number of players that were very competitive in the Fantasy Strike community came from other genres that were not fighting games. Like, there's also some fighting game crossover. There's the Super Turbo folks, there's the Guilty Gear folks, there's some of the anime folks in the scene. But, like, it was really interesting because there was a not insignificant number of players who were brought in because of the approachability aspect, and then really embrace the complexity that is in the game. So it only makes sense that even if you're sticking more towards the approachable side, that you're layering in these extra bits of complexity in order to appeal to this newfound player base. This was the natural progression of fighting games and why they are so complex at its core, because people crave more once they understand what is so enjoyable about the fundamental aspects. The fact is, there are so many other aspects of fighting games which are a detriment to new players or inexperienced players, that are super enjoyable for intermediate to advanced players. So there's a reason this progression happens. I'm glad that we course corrected so hard in some ways in the approachability movement, and that we're working our way back.